It seems pretty simple, right? Hitting someone is wrong. Trespassing on their property is wrong. But what's fascinating is that the law has this gray area where if the circumstances are just right, those wrongs can actually be, well, right. Today, we're going to dive into the world of legal defenses. These are the justifications that can take a case that looks totally clear-cut and flip it completely on its head. So let's just get right to it. Is it ever okay to break the rules? I mean, our first gut instinct is probably to say, no, of course not. But in the eyes of the law, it's a whole lot more complicated than that. And the answer, believe it or not, is a surprising yes, as long as you have a really, really good, legally solid reason. Now, this isn't about finding a loophole or getting away with something. It's about having a justification, what the law calls an affirmative defense, that can actually clear you of any liability. Okay, so if you need one of these legal justifications, where do you even start? Well, we start with the most common, most powerful one of all. It's something we all deal with every single day: permission. This is the legal idea of consent. And the core principle, it comes from this old Latin saying, is basically this: to one who is willing, no wrong is done. It's pretty simple. If you genuinely agree to something, you can't really turn around later and sue the person for doing that exact thing you agreed to. Now, we give permission in a couple of main ways. The first is what we call express consent. This is the obvious one. You say it out loud or you sign a form before surgery. But just as important is implied consent. Think about it. When you join a pickup football game, you don't sign a waiver, right? But the very act of you playing the game implies that you consent to the usual physical contact. The law totally gets that context is everything. But, and this is a really big but, consent has very strict limits. The key thing to remember is that you only consent to what you actually agreed to. So, if you give a surgeon permission to operate on your right ear, that permission doesn't just magically carry over to your left ear. The second they step outside that scope of consent, that defense just vanishes. So that's what happens when you agree to let something happen. But what about when you are actively trying to stop something from happening? This moves us out of the world of permission and into the world of protection and the very specific legal rules for fighting back. Okay, so to legally claim self-defense, you've got to hit 3 key points. First, you have to genuinely believe the threat is happening right now or is about to. This isn't for getting even for something that happened yesterday. Second, and this is so important, the force you use has to match the threat. And third, you can't have started the fight and then turn around and claim you were just defending yourself. That second rule, proportional force, that's the one that can get really tricky. What does that even mean in a real-world situation? Let's just walk through a quick example. Okay, picture this. Someone grabs your wallet. They're running away. They don't have a weapon. They're not threatening your life. They're just stealing your stuff. So you absolutely have a right to try and get your property back. But how far does that right go? Can you use any means necessary? Can you actually use deadly force to stop that thief? And the answer, in the eyes of the law, is an absolute, no exceptions, never. This perfectly highlights a core value of our legal system. Human life, even the life of someone committing a crime, is seen as infinitely more valuable than any piece of property. You are never, ever allowed to use deadly force just to protect your things. All right, let's zoom out a bit. We've talked about personal conflict, but what about bigger community-level problems? Sometimes you might have to damage one person's property in order to save a lot of other people. This is called the privilege of necessity. Now, necessity actually breaks down into 2 different types, and the differences are critical. First, you have public necessity. This is when you act to save the entire community, like tearing down a house to stop a wildfire from spreading. In that case, you've got a complete defense. You don't have to pay for the damage. But with private necessity, you're only acting to save yourself or maybe a few other people. You're still allowed to do it, but you have to pay for any damage you cause. This all comes from a really famous old case. A ship captain was caught in a terrible storm, so he kept his boat tied to a dock to save it. But the storm battered the boat against the dock and caused a lot of damage. The court's decision really nails the idea of private necessity. They said the captain had every right to save his ship, but the ship's owner still had to pay to fix the dock. Basically, you can take shelter, but you've got to pay for your stay. So beyond these big, broad ideas, the law also carves out special rules for very specific situations. Let's look at one that you might see play out in any store on any given day. So if a shopkeeper thinks someone is shoplifting, they're allowed to detain them. But to avoid getting sued for false imprisonment, they have to follow this strict 3-part checklist. The suspicion has to be reasonable, the way they detain the person has to be reasonable, no humiliation or crazy force, and the amount of time they hold them has to be reasonable and brief. If they fail on any one of those points, that privilege is gone. So as you can see, whether we're talking about consent or self-defense or necessity, there's this one golden thread that runs through all of them. It's not about memorizing a bunch of black and white rules. It's all about one core idea: applying the principle of reasonableness to the specific context of whatever is happening. So we've walked through the legal lines that decide when a wrong can be right. The law says you can use force to defend yourself, but not deadly force over a wallet. It says a shopkeeper can detain someone, but only in a way that's reasonable. So that leaves one last question, and this one isn't for a judge or a jury, it's for you. Now that you know where the law draws its boundaries, where do you draw your own?